Hi there, it's Mrs F with my video on the challenges of 1923. I'm going to be following the Edexcel specification, but you'll find that a lot of the content is also relevant to other exam boards. This lesson is part of the early challenges to the Republic from 1919 to 1923. Last week we looked at the challenges to the Republic from left-wing and right-wing groups. In this lesson, we're going to look at hyperinflation, the reasons for and effects of the French occupation of the Ruhr. So let's start by looking at the causes of the French occupation of the Ruhr. By the end of 1922, Germany had failed to pay several instalments of their reparations on time. So in January 1923, France and Belgium decided to occupy the Ruhr region in western Germany to take over the coal mines, steelworks and factories for themselves. Now, of course, the Germans were in no position to fight back against this occupation. The Ruhr, as you can see from the map on the right hand of the screen, was within the Rhineland, and this had been demilitarised under the Treaty of Versailles. So instead, the German government urged its workers to follow a policy of passive resistance, where they basically went on strike and refused to work. The French responded by arresting any German workers who got in the way and bringing in their own workers for the factories instead. So as you can imagine, there was huge anger and resentment towards the French for this occupation, and in fact there were some attacks carried out on the French workers. But the Weimar government was also hated for the occupation as well. Although there was nothing they could realistically do, it did still make them look weak. Unfortunately for Germany, the occupation of the Ruhr had a very crippling effect, because it contained many factories and around 80% of their coal, iron and steel reserves. This meant that Germany's debts increased, their unemployment went up, and it worsened the shortage of goods which already existed. Now we're going to look at the consequences of the occupation of the Ruhr. Even before this event occurred, Germany had been suffering from inflation, which is when prices go up because the value of German money had been falling. But the occupation of the Ruhr led to hyperinflation, which is when inflation gets out of control. Inflation was already a problem in Germany due to the huge debts that had been run up during World War I. In fact, all of Germany's reserves of gold had already been spent. But then things were made worse by the Treaty of Versailles. As we've already learned, some of the main wealth-earning areas were lost to other nations, and Germany was also required to pay reparations under the Treaty of Versailles. However, the government made things even worse. The government needed to pay their debts, but the occupation of the Ruhr meant that they received less money from taxes, and to make things worse, they also had to pay the striking workers who were no longer creating wealth for Germany. So unable to gain money from taxes, the government decided to print more money. Initially, printing extra money did make it easier for the government to pay reparations, but it also made inflation even worse. Became a vicious cycle. The more prices rose, the more money was printed, and then this in turn made prices rise again. By 1923, prices had reached spectacular heights, and this extreme inflation is known as hyperinflation. One of the best illustrations of hyperinflation is looking at the cost of the price of a loaf of bread, since this was a main staple part of the diet of the workers. In 1919, it would have cost you 1 mark for a loaf of bread, but just look at that insane price by 1923. During hyperinflation, normal living became impossible. printing presses could not produce enough currency. People had to pin money to letters because stamps were useless. They had to carry bundles of money in baskets and even wheelbarrows. Many workers were paid twice a day so they could rush out and buy goods before prices rose even further. Some shops even refused to take money at all, reverting back to the more primitive payment in kind, which is where you swap goods or barter. Some people even raided shops because they couldn't afford food. As you can see in the pictures, money was so worthless that children even played with huge wads of banknotes. And because goods became more valuable than money, it was actually cheaper to burn the banknotes for fuel than it was to buy coal. As with any economic crisis, there were winners and losers from hyperinflation. As I've already mentioned, some workers were paid twice a day, but other workers were only paid monthly and they simply couldn't keep up with the price rises. Things were even harder for those people who lived on fixed incomes. Think of people who were on pensions, the war, disabled people, and the unemployed. They always received the same amount of money each week. These incomes may well have been fixed a few years before and were now worth nothing. So these people faced homelessness and starvation. Something which particularly affected the middle classes was the losing of life savings. So this money simply became worthless. But some people actually benefited from hyperinflation. Imagine if you were somebody who'd got yourself into a lot of debt. Well, all of a sudden it was really easy to pay it off because money was so worthless. Big businesses also benefited. They took out huge loans to buy property or to invest in their businesses, knowing that in a few months their repayments would be pretty much nothing. Some unscrupulous people hoarded goods and then sold them for a large profit when prices went up. Foreign visitors also benefited as the value of their own currency rose against the German mark, so they could buy much more with their money. As you can imagine, German people bitterly resented anyone who made money out of their suffering. After August 1923, a new chancellor called Gustav Stresemann found solutions to some of the problems of 1923, and we'll look at that in my next lesson. However, hyperinflation did major long-term damage. The first main point is that confidence was undermined in democracy. Many in the working classes decided to turn to the more extreme left-wing party of communism, believing that a more radical solution was needed to help further their interests. In contrast, many of the wealthy went further to the right and longed for a return of the Kaiser, which they saw as being the good old days. And the middle classes, who previously had been big supporters of the Republic, came to blame it for their suffering, and they also turned to more right-wing parties as well. Hyperinflation is sometimes referred to as the scar that never healed. Germans were terrified that hyperinflation would return. And when another economic crisis hit with the Wall Street crash in 1929, many people turned to the one man who promised to rescue them from their problems, Adolf Hitler. So, we've now finished looking at the early challenges to the Weimar Republic. Next lesson, we'll start looking at the recovery of the Republic between 1924 and 1929, looking in particular at the work of Gustav Stresemann, who I mentioned in the previous slide. I hope that you found this video useful, and if you have, check out what's coming next week.